we're just going to go through the end-to-end processes here, sort of starting. We've got a model of plan, buy, move, sell, very simple, high level. This would be getting visibility to the end-to-end processes of your supply chain. We're going to start to zoom in a bit at various moments and talk through some interventions made that helped out, leveraging some various technologies or tools. In terms of, the end-to-end planning, right? Buying, moving, and then ultimately selling. You can apply this, and underneath there's quite a lot of level 3 or level 4 processes underneath that describe what happens. And this is a bit of that model where we talk about visibility end to end, but how often are we actually throwing it on paper and actually putting boxes of what we do here? So in terms of picking moments, I think one of the things we're seeing is on the transportation side around vendor and carrier management. A great case here where there are organizations that in an organization we work with that automatically and even some cases dynamically can assess your carrier or fleet costs. And so I think if you look at the right hand side and imagine we've protected some client data here, but the ability to understand whether it's UPS, FedEx, or internal fleets or whatever local carriers are using. Right now we're having a hard time understanding, is this the right cost structure? Is this too much? I don't know if we can continue to afford this. Are other organizations getting a better deal, et cetera? Leveraging some benchmarking tools, leveraging what people are paying on the spot market for similar organization sizes. Got a lot of great data available for large tier 1 carriers. And so having tools that can automatically, work with your master data, analyze it, compare it to benchmark, and give you variance reports of what you're paying versus what you ought to be paying, or maybe what you're paying in another region and not paying here, is a great way to extract some initial costs and get a sense of this. And you're seeing pattern recognition, you're seeing tools like RPA leveraged when looking at, sometimes we have great metadata with regard to our carriers. Sometimes we have raw invoices, maybe it's, so we realize the complexities of master data in this element. Sometimes you need, PDF or recognition tools to automatically detect variances on those actual invoices versus what we've expected in the contract. And so, in philosophy, it sounds like that would be an easy thing. And we've got lots of companies that have dedicated teams auditing that. Those organizations that can automatically detect that, predict it, leverage tools to manage their fleet costs are winning in this space. And so I think this is one of the first interventions, maybe upstream, as you're planning and managing freight that we're seeing. So in terms of more interventions or deep dives of what some organizations are doing, let's focus on within the 4 walls. I think one of the things that we're seeing is just getting back to basics on some of this. There are some advanced technologies around auto pick. We've seen guided vehicles, bulk RFID scanning, even some drone technologies for dynamic cycle counts and working on life cycle management. But I think that some of these are being portrayed as silver bullets within the network. A lot of organizations are struggling to, at an isolated point in time, they've got so many parallel projects running. Can we just work with the operators, come up with a plan of 10 to 15 projects that we have great business cases for, updating the pick path, updating the way we release orders, doing classic op clock projects, stock flow projects. Now, I think that ironically, this is supply chain 4.0, but we're seeing a lot of organizations where the weakest link in their chain is a distribution center or a facility that isn't running that well. And it's because, not necessarily because they don't have the most advanced technology, it's because that, perhaps the pandemic, the way it hit them was it exposed a lot of weaknesses or cracks in processes that just weren't managed or sustained really well. And so coming up with pragmatic implementable solutions within the DC is critical, because what we're seeing now is a lot of IT's got an idea to deploy a new TMS, or we've got isolated projects happening and nothing's sticking and nobody's listening to the operators. And so I think getting back to the basics in some cases here and doing some business cases on some of the technologies is some of the basic things that we see a lot of organizations still struggling with. So you can see a lot of the examples of projects here across the different dimensions. But I know it's not maybe a silver bullet for some of you, but this is what's differentiating some of the world-class within the four-wall warehouses, et cetera. So moving in, we'll keep doing some examples of other things we're seeing. This is actually a very old case by a friend and colleague. And I think that in terms of inventory optimization, I know this is a lot to look at here, but the reason why it is because inventory effects in terms of the interaction between manufacturing and supply chain are quite complex. Even in an example here, a couple $100 million in sales, maybe 75 finished goods SKUs. This is a causal loop diagram. And so I think this is a portrayal where you can see in the key there, it's really an interaction map of what the effects are between and how SKUs move through the system. And so again, I'm not going to belabor this, but this is a fairly simple example. You can imagine that more complex examples take up, you probably couldn't see anything on there. But I think that the point of this is that the next slide here is what's the impact of updating one MOQ for one SKU set across the organization, or what's the impact of one lever within safety stock level, or reduction of 15 minutes in changeover time downstream, whether how long we hold it in the warehouse, how long it takes to get to the customer, or what about the upstream variation of something that takes 3 days instead of 2 with the updated standard deviation. There's 12 things here that have changed as a result of one change. And I think that that's one of the complexities we're seeing people not understanding necessarily. The thing is, a lot of organizations are digitizing these ecosystems, leveraging some simulation platforms so that decision-making is fairly automatic, or scenario planning with regard to the impact of, changing a safety stock level or changing a setting in MRP has on the downstream ecosystem. And so again, I think that an old case, but imagine this digitized. This is what a lot of organizations are moving to simulate impacts of various things that they're touching within inventory.
Sure.
So again, go ahead.
I just wanted to jump in on this one because it's one of my favorite slides, even though it's kind of complex and busy. But this, just so people understand, this was a frozen food manufacturing plant. They basically made restaurant quality Asian food, egg rolls, and stuff like that. And it was in Columbus, and they had a huge inventory problem. And one of my students, Joe Serrato, is the person that took this systems dynamics modeling and did this. And he did one of the best jobs of any student I've ever had do this. But I think, Jared, this is an example of an industrial and systems engineering tool that's been around for a long time. I mean, systems dynamics modeling was developed back in the 70s at MIT. It's a precursor in some respects to simulation, don't you think?
Exactly. And some of the digital supply chains are leveraging that, whether it's a SIP platform like Simulator, what have you, or even some homegrown solutions leveraging Python and a UI on top, are leveraging this and doing scenario modeling. Or imagine your SKU set as an input dynamically. When things change, the ability to say, oh, this is your new bottleneck here, and this is what's going to happen to potentially your total working capital value. That's a huge thing now to do, because it's a huge chunk of work to do manually, as we know.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We've, in the operational analytics webinars we've been doing, Jared, we talked about aha moments, right? And this, when Joe put this thing together and shared it with the top team in that plant, I mean, it was like cerebral popcorn. Light bulbs were clicking. They got so many insights from the work that Jared did here. It really made made them more productive because they knew what levers to pay attention to. Whereas before it was sort of the complexity overwhelmed them. They didn't really know what to push on, what to manage first, second, third, right?
100%. And I think, I know this is a cutting edge supply chain tools. I think, yes, there are organizations that have digitized and simulated this, but there's a very large amount of organizations that haven't even gotten something like this on paper for their basic, simple supply chains. And that's why, I wanted to reinforce some pragmatic things that you can do now, without necessarily leveraging ChatGPT or advanced AI. To understand and predict inventory in the context of your supply chain and manufacturing units. So in terms of zooming in again, dynamic scenario modeling. So obviously, being able to detect and simulate the impact of a new facility or different characteristics of a facility, whether it's its ability to handle more outbound cube or an expansion or racking that allows us to have more space or primary pick slots, or SKU setup, or new store locations or entities that are thus going to require some type of either third party or internal model. I think the ability to leverage some technologies to be able to make that scenario easy to understand and simple. We see a lot of organizational energy and supply chain analytics units doing this manually or doing this without tools, or perceiving some of the simulation or network platforms to be quite expensive, 6-figure or more, or the need to have some advanced TMS capabilities or planning capabilities within your ERP to be able to do this. And the reality is nowadays, there are products like OptiLogic and others that can do this for a fraction of the cost, because supply chain and people are becoming more aware of it. The platforms in that space are becoming quite reasonable. The small to mid-market now are leveraging some of these tools. And so I'd encourage, if it feels like this is something that's more advanced or, too expensive, I'd encourage you to rethink some of that. I think the organizations that can, simulate 10, 12, 15 scenarios of their network as part of an annual planning cycle, or dynamically, or, imagine organizations that can ingest, their forecasted sales into your supply chain as a holistic model. How often are we doing that? We do it when we need to answer a question from the board, which is, what if we got a new warehouse in Columbus, Ohio? But how often are we ingesting dynamic forecasted sales into our model to say, oh, by the way, we're at 88% capacity in 16 months if we don't do anything? And those conversations still aren't happening as frequently as you would think. So I think this is one example where this is not as difficult of a job as you may think it is. And I think that if you're not doing this, you may want to consider that. So I think that's really the network modeling piece as a deep dive. And again, we could go further into a lot of these, but these are some of the interventions that are being made across the ecosystem that organizations that are doing this well are executing well, right? In terms of our portfolio and our SKU set, so moving all the way upstream, SKU performance of the portfolio of our SKU set, this is a custom sort of benefit to burden model of how we can assess one individual SKU and its performance. And so, juxtapose this on the services side to a service, how we evaluate the relationship of a SKU, not just on profitability, but on its impact on our broader value chain is huge. A lot of organizations are not taking into account the complexity, the demand volatility on its impact on manufacturing as they evaluate SKUs. Often sales is driving profitability and volume as the two primary dynamics, but you can see there's a ton of other variables associated with your SKU set to evaluate. And there's huge downstream ripple effects. Once you've got some type of a very simple tool to evaluate your SKU portfolio, a portrayal like this around what we call a benefit to burden matrix to evaluate the viability of your SKUs is critical. There's some SKUs that might be high performers, but because the demand volatility inbound from the supplier, has a standard deviation of say 26 days, you might realize that that downstream impact on your changeovers and your MRP planning actually causes this to be much lower in profitability. And so having those conversations about your SKU set in advance and managing your portfolio in advance before releasing it into production as part of an ongoing process is a high maturity concept that still a lot of organizations are not doing. So I wanted to reemphasize this more on the upstream planning side around your portfolio. And I think, one of the other case studies is, we have a lot of service entities, shared service entities that support us within our supply chains. We have a lot of IT enablement, HR, finance. There's a lot of workflow management and a lot of processes that aren't on the floor or aren't in the warehouse or aren't, on the truck. Things that are hard to see, we can't really see them. And so I think one of the other pieces we're seeing is that, off the shelf, built in, in this case, Microsoft Power Automate and some of the existing tools within Dynamics 365 are getting quite powerful in terms of their ability to leverage RPA and some AI functionality. There are big baked in applications that are quite impactful. In this case, what you see is a values to our process map here of our process steps. And the team went in and just said, the green things are great candidates for automation. They're fairly manual tasks and they could be automated. Maybe it's an email from one person to another that has a form that somebody types in manually, and then they type that into the ERP system. Or maybe we've got an invoice that we're processing and we look at it, it's physical, and we write it down. There's a lot of those things still. When we talk about supply chain costs, there are other P&Ls, right, where we can repatriate to higher value activities by doing some basic things like this. The yellow boxes are potential candidates, but in this case, we picked one, and this was an automated file upload for Power Automate to deal with PDF data that was a little messy. And through a couple simple tools, we're talking a few days worth, you can automate that process completely. And so as you take little chunks like that, you can begin to reinvest them into other areas. This is wildly applicable within the four walls for some of your inventory management processes, as well as dealing with complex carrier logistics, et cetera. So I think this is just another example where, there are some nice, simple tools that are out there. You don't have to invest in a full AI suite to knock out some of these manual workflows and processes. So again, I just wanted to reemphasize some of the things you have available to you already, likely within your ERP, or likely, again, we're technology agnostic. We don't sell any software solutions, but I think that a little bit of a conversation with IT or doing some research, you can find some simple applications to make a dent in some of this. So I think in terms of, other applications, and gosh, we talked through 6 little deep dives here across the value chain. There's so many more that we could talk through, but these are examples of interventions being made in various areas, leveraging some advanced technologies, leveraging some very basic technologies and tools that are differentiating the great supply chains from the average. And I want to reemphasize too that, getting back to the basics in some cases, sometimes it's the pandemic maybe didn't expose things. Maybe it just exposed some weaknesses in your existing warehouse because they had some processes that weren't in control or not mapped out, or the turnover hurt them. They don't necessarily need that $750,000 pick to light system. So in terms of other things, gosh, people right now is huge. Obviously, we're all feeling that. People costs have gone up across the board. Flexibility of people's schedules and what people want now, especially on second shift, third shift, order selectors, different areas that we're seeing have 70, 80% plus turnover, are becoming some of the bottleneck. So how we get creative and investing in people and thinking through the flexibility of their schedules. Now, some of the predecessors of doing this right involve getting a clean dock and getting your ops clock managed really well, and getting your inbound schedules tighter, and getting your picking windows and put away tighter inside the 4 walls of the warehouse. So the organizations that are leveraging creativity in terms of stay bonuses or putting them through university or investing in their career so that they can stick with them is actually starting to pay off, even though the initial investment might seem a bit high. An 80% turnover on, say, a second shift order selecting shift, the cost of turnover and retraining and onboarding and impact of case per hour movement is massive. And so that consider the initial investment of taking care of people and getting them to stay, even though your initial cost profile might look a bit scary on paper. Do the math on what your real onboarding, training, and leveraging third parties, temp agencies where half don't work out. Really do some math on that investment and put it in cash flow month by month and see what you need to do. Those organizations that are doing that, especially the smaller ones that are across the street from a mega warehouse where they're doing pay for performance and maybe paying an extra $5 an hour, they feel overwhelmed by their ability to do that. But I think creativity is starting to pay off in some of these. I think, like we mentioned, there's some simple applications that are already being leveraged right now, and some more complex that we didn't even talk through today, but they're available at your fingertips, likely, especially in the mid-market now. I think we've seen a few case studies for Chat GPT and some natural language processing applications, but to date, I'd say be cautiously optimistic. We've seen some applications potentially with help bots and SOPs and its ability to ingest information and serve as a knowledge repository. But in terms of core operational and making decisions at this point on your network or your inbound freight, et cetera, I'd say be very, very cautious. We don't have a lot yet in terms of its ability to cohesively manage through an actual solution set versus just assembling language that pairs or sounds like it ought to fit together. And I think finally, on the technology side, there are some simulation platforms that are way more attainable. So there's some mini ERPs, cloud-based technologies that companies are leveraging, or even homegrown solutions that are way more powerful than they used to be. I think finally here, benchmarking, those organizations that have, at least internally, looking at where we're at and comparing those, you think that's sort of fundamental, but still there's organizations not doing that or even not capturing the data in a similar way. There's still niche benchmarks that are very tough to get, especially, picking ice cream in the freezer on third shift. It's going to be hard to compare case per hour load to something else. So you want to get more niche benchmarks. You may want to partner up or invest in some platforms there to find out really what's possible within the organization. So I think that these are some other considerations we didn't touch through as much, but attributes of organizations that are doing this well that we wanted to share. And so I think in terms of, bringing this together, one, how are you doing? There's some models that work really well that are simple within your supply chain. Get a pulse check of how we're doing, get some visibility, create a map of what the processes are, 1 through 5 or 1 through 3, depending on what you can. Get back to the basics on some of this, and then make interventions at the right moments in your value chain at the right time using the right tools. And benchmarks are key. I think one of the first questions is what's possible. Maybe the pandemic as a percentage of sales, maybe that was an extra 1.3% of sales. And we just have to acknowledge that as a result of inflation, but this is what's attainable as a result of these 12 projects, and this is what's possible, and this is how we're going to do it. Getting back to the basics of that, leveraging some benchmarks. Be careful of some of those technologies that are promised to be, especially robots and other automations. Given the price point still now, I think a lot of those still are prohibitive or have 36+ month payoff periods. I think a lot of the networks still have that those one or two sites that are the weakest link and need the basics done. And they need the basics done well over a consistent period of time. So let's not overcomplicate some of these things. Let's make sure that one of the tendencies with all this is we're taking on too much. And so let's talk about capacity of our people and what we can actually afford and what we can actually manage from a change perspective. We can't do 46 parallel massive projects within a site, right? We've got to do 6 things maybe really, really well. Our ability to make great business cases and understand the end-to-end view of a business case, not just working capital, but P&L impact, indirect cost avoidance, and growth related, are quite critical as we look at this. And they're being done too quickly now, and people are making really fast and errors in what they're moving towards. And finally, I'd say just understanding, yes, demand volatility has gone up significantly, but our ability to understand that and then flow that through our network, whether it's through SKU, portfolio design, or MRP planning, still is a weak link in a lot of organizations. That's going to smooth downstream bottlenecks within manufacturing, and I think you'll see and reap rewards from that. So anyways, I know I threw a lot at you on these, but there's some really cool, there's some great tools end to end that can help out as we move into 2023. So